It is thus that enlightenment lets itself be understood by faith. It presents itself in this bad light because just by being in relation to an other, it gives itself a negative reality or exhibits itself as the opposite of itself. But pure insight and intention must enter into this relationship, for it is their realization. This at first appeared as a negative reality. Perhaps its positive reality is better constituted. Let us see how things stand with this. If all prejudice and superstition have been banished, the question arises, what next? What is the truth enlightenment has propagated in their stead? It is already declared that this positive content is in its extirpation of error, for that alienation of itself is just as much its positive reality. In its approach to what for faith is absolute spirit, it interprets any determinateness it discovers there as wood, stone, etc., as particular real things, since in this way it grasps in general every determinateness, that is all content and filling, as something finite, as a human entity and mere idea. Absolute being becomes for it a vacuum to which no determinations, no predicates can be attributed. The attribution of predicates to such a vacuum would be in itself reprehensible, and it is just in such a union that the monstrosities of superstition have been produced. Reason, pure insight, is certainly not empty itself, since the negative of itself is for it and is its content. On the contrary, it is rich, but rich only in particularity and limitations. To let nothing of that sort appertain to absolute being or be attributed to it, this is the prudent behavior of reason, or pure insight, which knows how to put itself and its finite riches in their proper place and how to deal with the absolute in a worthy manner. There are two main things going on here in paragraph 557. First, Hegel is really giving us kind of a wrap-up of what has happened in the previous paragraphs that we have already discussed, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But what's really important here, where the forward movement is taking place, is in what he's talking about as the positive reality of the Enlightenment, or indeed its truth, its Wahrheit, what it is that it shows itself as being, no longer just in terms of certainty, but in a reflexive way. And this is particularly important because the Enlightenment is portrayed both retrospectively by Hegel looking back at it and by us looking back at it from a much greater distance, where we almost mythologize enlightenment, don't we? We turn it into a much simpler period than it was, but also from its own movement forward, its own self-understanding. The Enlightenment is being presented, or it presents itself as the time in which truth really starts to get its place. So we can't escape this issue of asking, well, what is the truth of this Enlightenment? And this is indeed, again, how we see Hegel prefiguring many of the themes of what people these days like to call deconstruction or the postmodern, or all those sorts of things. He's really making it talk about itself, which is what tends to produce some issues. The Enlightenment does not actually measure up to its own ideology. And we're going to see that happening much later in the Absolute Freedom and the Terror, talking about what happened in the French Revolution in a very determinate way. But we're already seeing it here. And Hegel in this paragraph, and then in the next paragraph and the paragraph after that, he's going to talk about three different aspects of that. So here he's sketching out the first aspect for us. Let's go back to the wrap-up material, though, before we go into that. So he says, it is thus that enlightenment lets itself be understood by faith. So there is a polemic going on not only of enlightenment against a static faith that is stuck there, sort of like a boxer who can't throw any punches, or whenever he does throw punches, he telescopes them very widely, and so they don't land any blows. Instead, if you actually read some of the works by people who we might see as representing faith during the Enlightenment, they provide some serious counterattacks. Some of them are off base, but some of them are things that Enlightenment does have to take seriously. The same thing, by the way, is going on in our own time in these interminable debates between atheists and theists, right? It's not as if the atheists are the ones who always win in terms of, producing the best arguments, or unless you automatically assume that the atheists are just going to win. They're the guys with the white hats against the black hats, in which case you're a member of what Hegel's calling this whole thing of enlightenment, right? So enlightenment has let itself be understood by faith as not actually operating itself in good faith, bona fide, you might say. And he says it presents itself in this bad light. Now notice he says it presents itself. Faith allowed enlightenment to speak for itself. It didn't just come up with some cookie cutter schematic things and then shoved enlightenment into that, the way that we see so many theistic polemics against faith do in our own time. The better ones actually say, so wait, what is it that you actually believe? What is it that you're teaching about what we religious people say? Oh, that's very interesting. Let's look at that a little bit more carefully. Oh, can I get some clarification from you on just how priestcraft and superstition have messed things up through history? And then it comes in and says, well, here's where you got this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. What do you have to say for yourself? And what it's doing is taking enlightenment, as we saw in the previous paragraphs, at its own word. And this presents problems at first. So he says, enlightenment gives itself a negative reality or exhibits itself as the opposite of itself, right? It's supposed to be eminently practical. Turns out not to be quite so practical. Faith ends up being more practical. Turns out, we can go on and on and on in these critiques. I don't need to rehearse them because we already covered that. So he says, pure insight and intention must enter into this relationship, for it is their realization. You see, enlightenment is sort of like a curiosity and an integrity that must drive itself forward, that cannot escape by making excuses, by cutting corners. Because if it does, it's just as much of a lying game as all that stuff that was going on in culture or that it thinks is going on in faith. Hegel has used this dynamic a number of times in the past. When we have genuine ethical commitment, that means being willing to sacrifice one's own creature comforts, one's own social status, one's own wanting to be right about things, to see where reason or self-consciousness, or if you like spirit, does in fact lead us. So this puts enlightenment and pure insight into a bit of a dilemma, doesn't it? And different people are going to go different ways. Some are going to become, in essence, fundamentalists or apologists of the Enlightenment. Others are going to take the Enlightenment yet further and continue on its dynamic, or what Hegel calls the dialectic. So he says, this at first appeared as a negative reality. Now we get into the second part. Perhaps in its positive reality, it's better constituted. So now let's take a look at what he's calling this positive reality. Here's the question. If all prejudice and superstition have been banished, this question arises. What next? What is the truth Enlightenment has propagated in their stead? What is the truth of the Enlightenment? What is it offering in place of superstition, in place of prejudice, in place of a focus on, picture thinking and particularity? what does it have to offer us after we've pulled down the statues and closed up the churches and told all the peasant people to quit, worshiping at these shrines, and given them some books instead, and brought them into school and educated them and taught them some natural science? This is a fundamental question. Now notice this is a question that we can ask sort of prospectively even before the Enlightenment is finished. And, usually it sounds a lot better, the answers that are given at that time by comparison to what we actually see when we run into them. So Hegel is going to say here, Enlightenment has already declared this positive content is in its extirpation, that's rooting out, tearing out the error. For that alienation of itself is just as much its positive reality. So this is very important. We've talked about this a number of times. Pure insight has a certain kind of circularity or reflexivity to it, but it also has a kind of emptiness. It doesn't have the content that faith has, the Inhalt in German. What is its content? Its content is a negative one, that of negating or critiquing faith. So can enlightenment continue to exist after faith has been taken off the scene, after it has been abolished? Will enlightenment remain enlightenment? Or is it going to become, you could say, self-critiquing, self-eating? Is it going to prey upon itself? So he goes on and he says, in its approach to what for faith is absolute spirit, enlightenment proposes a different way of understanding it. How is enlightenment going to be worshiping, or at least conceiving of, God, absolute being, the divine? Could be the universe, if you like. There's a lot of different variations possible. Or humanity. We could take Feuerbach and other humanists and ask what are they going to put in place of the object of faith. And Hegel says there's an important distinction that's being made here that's going to render this into a kind of void, or in German here, Vakuum, right? Vacuum. That's just the Latin term. And there were many debates about this. Are there really voids? Well, Hegel is saying we can at least imagine a void, and that is what enlightenment, which is supposed to be all about reason, is doing. It's imagining a subject without any predicates whatsoever. So he goes on and he says, it interprets any determinateness in absolute spirit as wood or stone or things like that. A statue, sort of rosary beads, whatever it is that you like, as determinacy, and therefore as a kind of limitation. This is why it thinks faith is really about superstition. Superstition would take the wood, the stone, as being the reality of the absolute being. And so he says, here we go. It interprets these as particular real things, and since in this way it grasps in general every determinateness as human entity, as idea, as essentially projection on our part. Projection by the person of faith, perhaps without knowing so, in which case they are just superstitious and foolish, or perhaps knowingly, in which case they are a hypocrite. Hegel's saying that the Enlightenment perspective takes that as, you might say, below the dignity of the absolute and below the dignity of the human being. So it proposes something different instead, a more direct relationship. He says, absolute being becomes for it a vacuum to which no determinations, no predicates can be attributed. The attribution of predicates to such a vacuum would be reprehensible. There is a normative claim being staked out here by the Enlightenment. You can't talk about God as caring about one particular people on earth, or as commanding that these people historically do this thing, this institution. That would be unworthy of a genuine deity who cares for the entire universe. You can't say that God would manifest himself, itself, herself, whatever you want to call it, in this determinate content here. Say this religious text, this temple, this ritual. That would be unworthy of the divine. So he goes on and he says, it's just from such a union that monstrosities of superstition have been produced. The human mind couldn't be content with grasping the purity of God, who we can find. The Enlightenment thought that we could find God through pure reason. The joke on them turned out, of course, to be that no, once you start doing that, you find out that somebody else can equally argue from pure reason to there not being a God, or not being the kind of God that you're talking about. And really, you can't even defend your concept of God because you've already removed all the predicates from it, so there's not a hell of a lot to work with. But we're not quite there yet. So pure insight is opposing this idea to the idolatry of faith, he's saying. So he goes on and he says, reason is certainly not empty itself. Reason is not this thing over here. Reason is got some sort of content precisely by being negational, by being negative. He says the negative of itself is for it. It can conceptualize itself as negative. And it also conceptualizes its opposite, which is faith. So he says, on the contrary, it is rich. The reason of the individual person, right? It is rich, but only rich in particularity and limitations. The individual person, understanding himself, herself, as the person of enlightenment in this entire dynamic, understands themselves by contrast to the absolute being as a determinate being, as particular, as limited. I am male, not female. I am now middle-aged, not young, right? I am this tall. I am not short. I'm not super tall. We can go on and on and on with these sorts of predicates. So he says, to let nothing of that sort appertain to absolute being, that is the prudent behavior of reason, of pure insight, which knows how to put itself and its finite riches, its resources, in their proper place and how to deal with the absolute in a worthy manner. What we're talking about here is an Enlightenment critique of religion in favor of a purified religion, a better relationship to the absolute being. In contrast to this empty being, there stands as the second moment of the positive truth of enlightenment, the singleness in general of consciousness and of all being, a singleness excluded from absolute being and in the form of absolute being in and for itself. Consciousness, which in its first reality is sense certainty and mere meaning, returns here to this from the whole course of its experience and is again a knowledge of what is purely negative of itself or of things of sense, that is, of things which immediately and indifferently confront its being for self. Here, however, it is not an immediate natural consciousness. On the contrary, it has become such for itself. Whereas at first it was at the mercy of every sort of entanglement into which it was plunged by its unfolding, and now has been led back by pure insight into its first shape, it has experienced that shape as result. Being based on the nothingness of all the other shapes of consciousness and hence of everything beyond sense certainty, this sense certainty is no longer mere meaning, but rather absolute truth. This nothingness of everything that lies beyond sense certainty is no doubt merely a negative proof of this truth, but it is not susceptible of any other. For the positive truth of sense certainty is in its own self the immediate being for self of the notion itself qua object, and that too in the form of otherness. The positive truth that every consciousness is absolutely certain that it is, and that there are other real things outside of it, and that in its natural being, it, like those things, is in and for itself or absolute. In the previous paragraph, Hegel talked about the first aspect of the truth of enlightenment, what it was that enlightenment had actually brought forward as the truth that would replace superstition, priestcraft, faith. What's the second? That's what he's going to discuss here in paragraph 558. And he says that in contrast to this empty absolute being, which he will talk about, which is still there in the background, now he's going to sketch out what is happening in terms of the subject, the individual person who is enlightened, who is engaging in enlightenment as an activity. And he says, what we're talking about here is the singleness, the Einzelheit of consciousness and of all being. All being except for, of course, the absolute being. This is quite interesting, though, because he's going to almost immediately talk about absolute being in and for itself, consciousness. But now we're talking about the single, the individual consciousness. Even, we might say, the separated consciousness, the one that is separating itself off from the rest of the world in its own understanding. And the other thing that's really interesting about this passage is that you notice he has here brought back in sense certainty. But he says that we've returned to this stage of sense certainty, which was the very beginning of the dialectic, but we've returned in a different way. We've gone through all of these sublations, all of these Aufhebung, right? And consciousness now is trying to grasp the world as a world of sensuous objects. But it's not approaching them with the same sort of naivete that it did at first. So he says, we have a singleness excluded from absolute being, and in the form of absolute being in and for itself. Consciousness, which in its first reality, in the very beginning of this book, right, was sense certainty, as he says, and mere meaning, meinen. There's kind of play on words there, of course, because, meinen means to intend or to, to mean, but it also means sort of the act of appropriation, making it mine, right? Or expressing what is mine. And he says it returns here from the whole course of its experience, which is this entire work, right? Consciousness has been building itself up, and it's now something different, having gone through these earlier stages of development. He says it's again a knowledge of what is purely negative of itself. Things of sense. Why are things of sense purely negative of itself? Well, consciousness itself, is that something that is of sense? I don't know. Can you smell your consciousness? Can you hear your consciousness? Can you turn your eyeballs around and look inside and see your consciousness? Now, of course, you might say, well, we put you in the MRI machine and neuroscience shows you your consciousness. We've already been through that in the physiognomy and phrenology part, right? What neuroscience actually shows us is MRI scans or correlations or interesting pictures, but it doesn't show us consciousness itself. We are, however, conscious. We exercise our consciousness practically as well as theoretically. And we do so in contradistinction to the things of sense that arise for us. And we can say, well, I am still a thing of sense. I am one object among the world, but I'm a peculiar kind of object. This almost sounds, if those of you who have read Jean-Paul Sartre, this is starting to sound a little bit like the being and nothingness arrangement of the in itself and the for itself. Well, Sartre took those concepts from Hegel in part. So he says, here, however, it is not an immediate natural consciousness. On the contrary, it has become so. So there's been a process of estrangement or alienation and a process of reconciliation or recuperation, reintegration, you might say. So he says, whereas at first, meaning back in the sense certainty section and earlier sections, it was at the mercy of every sort of entanglement into which it was plunged by its own unfolding. It had no idea what it was unfolding into, by the way, and now has been led back by a pure insight, right? to its first shape, it has experienced that shape as a result. It's no longer just a thing that it's thrown into. This is something it can look backwards at and say, aha, you know what? This is one of the things that you might see in the Enlightenment. I guess the Epicureans were right. Maybe it really is just bodies and the ways that they're arranged. And this is what does happen with some figures who are thinking about things. Or, maybe those other materialists were right. Maybe the people who had a sort of naive reaction to the sense world and said, yeah, I don't know about that spirit or psyche or whatever it is that you're calling it, Plato, Aristotle, whoever, Christians, Jews. Maybe they were right. That's what the Enlightenment person is actually asserting. So he goes on and he says, being based on the nothingness of all the other shapes of consciousness, and hence everything beyond sense certainty, this sense certainty is no longer mere meaning, but rather absolute truth. So what we have here is a stage of the Enlightenment, where the Enlightenment is looking back and saying, they had it right at sense certainty, they just didn't realize that they had it right. Each of these other stages, each of these projects, where we thought that we had realized what consciousness really is, what the absolute being is, it turned out not to fulfill its promises, but to open a way to yet another state or shape or dynamic for consciousness. And now we're here. Now we can actually say, okay, we're going back to that stance, but we're doing so in a thoughtful way. So he goes on and he says, the nothingness of everything that lies beyond sense certainty is no doubt a merely negative proof of this truth, but it's not susceptible, he says, of any other. The nothingness of absolute being itself, the nothingness of the rest of the world. This is Hegel depicting something similar to what Heidegger later on will call finitude, isn't it? So he goes on and he says, the positive truth of self-certainty is in its own self, the immediate being for self of the notion itself qua object, how it's relating itself to itself. And that too in the form of otherness. The things that we sense are other than us, but we are sensing them. We're the ones who grasp them. The world circulates, you might say, around our vantage point. Even though in another sense we can say, well, I know the world doesn't circulate around our vantage point, and the universe isn't centered around this piddly little planet in this tiny solar system. But consciousness is special in a sense. So he goes on and he says, the positive truth that every consciousness is absolutely certain that it is, and that there are other real things outside it, and that in its natural being, it, like those things, is and for itself and absolute. This is the second aspect of what Hegel is calling the truth of the Enlightenment. This is the way the Enlightenment is, you might say, constructing its metaphysics, making sense out of itself, and it's doing so in such a way that the people can say, aha, through this framework, I can understand what the hell I am and what objects are and what the relationship between us is. We don't need to necessarily bring in the absolute being in order to do so, although that is going to come back in.